Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our Croatan conversation on worker representation on boards. This is part of a larger series bringing leaders working on the front lines of finance, social change, and ecological resilience into deep dialogue about collaborative opportunities to invest in solutions to some of the world's toughest social and environmental challenges. This is a project of Croatan Institute, an independent nonprofit research institute that works at the critical nexus of sustainability, finance, and economic development. My name is Liz Umlas. I'm a senior fellow at Croatan Institute and a lecturer at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, and I'll be moderating this conversation. So to start with some housekeeping notes, as you'll see on the screen, this conversation is being recorded, and it will become available on our website and YouTube page, and it will be emailed to participants afterwards. Zoom attendees can ask questions using the Q&A box at any time, and we'll do our best to answer those at the end of the presentation. If you're watching on YouTube, you can post your questions in the comments box, and again, we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can at the end. I'd like to also say that we have an upcoming conversation on October 28th on multi-region perspectives on conservation finance and sustainable forestry. Croatan fellow John Fenderson will lead a discussion on conservation finance for sustainable forestry with leaders from across the country, including Peter Stein of Lime Timber, Amrita Vatsal of EcoTrust Forest Management, and Olive Watkins, steward of an agroforestry farm in North Carolina and founder of the Black Farmer Fund. You can find more detail at croatanconversations.org, and we'll post the registration links in the chat box. So turning to today's conversation, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. We have Lenore Palladino, who is an assistant professor of economics and public policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. A former labor and community organizer, Lenore writes and researches policies to reform corporate governance, including the impacts of worker representation on corporate boards in the United States. Cynthia Murray is a founder of United for Respect, a multiracial organization working to empower workers in the retail industry, and she's a 20-year Walmart employee. Cindy testified at a Senate hearing in support of the Reward Work Act, which would require publicly owned companies to allow workers to elect a third of a company's board members. She filed the shareholder resolution at Walmart this year, calling on the board of directors to allow hourly employees as candidates for the corporate board of directors. Eddie Eni is the Director of Corporate Accountability at United for Respect. He has 25 years of experience as a labor activist. He's worked closely with Cindy and other leaders at Walmart to increase the company's base wage from $7.25 to $11 an hour and to win paid family leave for 500,000 full-time employees. He's also helped laid-off workers at Toys R Us to win a $20 million hardship fund. And Janet Williamson is a senior policy officer at the Trades Union Congress, a national trade union center in the United Kingdom, where she leads the TUC's work on corporate governance and capital markets. Janet has written widely on corporate governance, executive pay, employee share ownership, shareholder engagement, and collective bargaining. She's led the TUC's work promoting workforce voice in corporate governance and is the author of the publication All Aboard, Making Worker Representation on Company Boards a Reality, which you can find on the TUC website. So what is the context for our subject today? In 2020, we've seen urgent and widespread protests demanding racial justice, which began in direct reaction to the killing of George Floyd and spread widely. COVID-19, which has had a disproportionate impact on people of color, has helped to expose the poor treatment of workers in many industries and the critical need for workers to be able to speak out to protect their rights. To cite just one very topical example of the inequities in the workplace, in recent research, the Economic Policy Institute found that Black women working in jobs deemed critical to COVID-19 recovery earn 11 to 27% less than white men in the same jobs. On the positive side, mobilization has sensitized both policymakers and the general public to calls for action. Even before the pandemic, we saw the rise of a broad-based debate globally on the need to move from a so-called maximizing shareholder value model to one that takes into account the impact of private sector activity on all stakeholders. We've also seen a significant rise of worker activism, with workers claiming their rights and denouncing abuses. For example, struggles in multiple countries for a livable wage, recent walkouts at US companies over sexual harassment, and workers using their own capital to file resolutions. Worker representation on boards is an approach that provides for workers to be represented on corporate boards and to have a say in decisions that affect them. Many European countries already have some sort of legislation providing for this. In the United States, however, where worker protections are weak and the past several decades have seen a severe undermining of fundamental rights in the workplace, the idea of worker representation on boards is a harder sell. Yet the idea is gaining ground, with US lawmakers sponsoring several bills incorporating the concept and shareholder resolutions being filed in favor of such representation at major US companies, including at Walmart, a resolution which two of our speakers were directly involved in and will discuss. In short, worker representation on boards is a timely topic. It functions within the existing system, it's a recognized corporate governance mechanism, but crucially, it redistributes part of corporate power and accountability to others besides senior management. In terms of the structure of today's conversation, we'll follow a short interview format. I will do a couple of rounds of questions to each of our speakers. They will also have the opportunity at any point to respond to each other if they would like. And then, time permitting, we'll open up to audience questions at the end. So again, please send any questions you have through to the Q&A box. So without further ado, let's turn to our first round. In this first round of questions, we'll be setting the scene a little bit. We'll start with a wide angle on worker representation on boards, and then we'll begin the discussion of a specific US case, which is the recent shareholder resolution at Walmart. And then we'll take a look at the United Kingdom, which is in the midst of its own debate about worker representation on boards, to find out how this debate is progressing. So for the first question, I'd like to turn to Lenore. Lenore, could you please set the landscape briefly on worker representation on boards? Specifically, what are the rationale, key strengths of, and challenges to this form of corporate governance?
Sure. How's my sound? Is that okay? Great. So thanks so much, Liz, and to everybody at Croatan for organizing this event, and to all the folks taking time to watch or listen today. It's great to see so many folks interested in this topic, and so many familiar names as well among the attendees. Because I think this is an important moment for this kind of conversation to happen. So let me answer that question maybe as sort of the person starting out by backing up to talk about how corporations currently function in the United States. And they function according to an ideology that we call shareholder primacy. What this means is that the idea is that corporations exist solely to make money for their shareholders. And it is exclusively shareholders who elect the main decision-making body of the corporation, the board of directors. But the crucial takeaway is that this is not the only way for companies to operate. We think that it is in the United States today because we are unfamiliar with other models, but it's not the only way for companies to operate. This model contributes directly to the economic and social inequalities that we have in the US today. So I see worker representation on corporate boards as just one of the ways in which we can start to return corporations to being institutions that better support economic innovation and sustainable prosperity. So I want to talk about why worker representation is so important to start in terms of who currently controls the board. And I don't know if you can put up the slides, but I'm a teacher, and so I like my visuals. So for many of us, we have a sense that we live in the US in a shareholder democracy, but we don't. Many people in the middle class do own some shares as part of a retirement portfolio, but we can't be confused about how unequal share ownership is across our economy. So let me briefly present a few examples of why shareholder primacy contributes to both economic and racial inequality in the US. And it's pretty simple. Ownership of corporate equity and therefore the gains that come from increasing shareholder wealth flows disproportionately to wealthy white households. This first slide shows you that the top 1% of American households by wealth owns over 50% of corporate equity, right? 1%, 50%. And then just the next 9% owns about another 35% of corporate equity. Conversely, the bottom 50% of American households own essentially no corporate equity. So when we talk about the benefits flowing to shareholders and control being exercised by shareholders over the corporate board, we have to understand what a small and elite economic group this is. And you can go on to the next slide. Briefly, you can see as well that corporate equity ownership is extremely skewed by race. Not surprising, we live in a country that's, has its foundations in chattel slavery, and the stratification of the economy has continued to the present day. You can see that white households own about 92% of all corporate equity. And then you can go to the final slide. So I do a lot of work looking at what we call shareholder payments, how the benefits of corporate activity are flowing to shareholders. This is just a brief visual of how those shareholder payments have risen over the decades. What this means is that the shareholder payments that comprise such a large portion of how corporations spend their money flow disproportionately to wealthy white households. So one way to change how corporations operate is to make sure that it's not just this elite group that exercises control over decision-making in the corporate boardroom. Other panelists can speak better than I can about how to best represent the interests of workers themselves in the workforce, in the boardroom. But we know that in the history of economic innovation, it's the expertise of workers that makes a tremendous difference in improving productivity over time. So rebalancing whose voices are involved in the decision-making makes it more likely that boards and executives will focus on innovation and shared prosperity rather than just maximizing short-term shareholder wealth. And this is important for American prosperity overall. Last thing I'll say briefly is just for a US audience, many of us are actually unfamiliar with this idea, and we don't know how common worker representation on boards is in Europe, in innovative economies like Germany and other countries across Europe. Worker representation on corporate boards is common. So we should know that this is a productive practice in other economies and think about how to best adopt it for the unique US context. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Lenore, for a really helpful stepping back and setting the stage, and also opening the door to talking about other models. I'd like to just start the discussion about the specific case of Walmart, and we'll return to it in subsequent rounds as well. But turning to Eddie, your organization, United for Respect, aims to change policies in order to improve retail workers' lives. Could you please tell us why the decision to go for worker representation on the board at Walmart? What is United for Respect's theory of change here? And what is the significance of workers per se filing the resolution?
Sure. Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Lenore, for that overview. At United for Respect, our decision to look into and to develop a strategy on winning worker board representation came from listening to people like Cindy, who you'll hear from in a minute, and many of her peers who've been leading an effort for over a decade to change conditions at Walmart. I want to step back a second first and state the obvious. What happens at Walmart matters to all of us. Walmart is an enormous company, and when they cut benefits for part-timers or undermine supply chain safety in Bangladesh, other companies follow. And their massive political spending also impacts our democracy and our ability to pass progressive legislation. So Walmart is the largest company in the world, and also largest corporate employer in the US with 1.5 million employees. They're also the largest employer of Black people, Latinx people, and women in the US. But with a starting wage or base wage of only $11 an hour and an over-reliance on part-time employees, hundreds of thousands of the people who work at Walmart and make it profitable face constant economic insecurity. And Walmart employees are consistently at the top of the list of those who require public assistance to make ends meet because the wages are so low. And as Lenore can tell you better than I can, under CEO Doug McMillon, the corporation has been spending billions on share buybacks, and all at the expense of a meaningful investment in the workforce. And lastly, some of the main beneficiaries of these expenditures are the Walton family, the Walton heirs, who are now worth over $200 billion, one family. So the good news is that Walmart is movable, and Cindy and her coworkers have led protests and campaigns that have resulted in Walmart increasing their wages and providing paid family leave, as Liz mentioned at the outset. But when Walmart increased wages, raising their base wage by $3 an hour over 3 years, two different things happened. One is they began quietly cutting hours and have been increasing, as I said before, the use of part-time employees. Secondly, most of the people who received this substantial wage increase were folks who were new or recent hires. And so this isolated long-term employees and deeply impacted morale, and really shows how out of touch Walmart is with their workforce. So, we think there are many good reasons to include the expertise of frontline workers in corporate boardrooms, but one of the most important ones is what Cindy will tell us more about, is we need a voice in what happens to the profits that we're making for these companies. And it also means that when employee and public health is at stake, as it is now with COVID-19, the board needs the expertise of frontline employees who are really the best suited to determine if corporate policies are effective and if they're being implemented consistently across stores to keep both employees and customers safe. From United for Respect's perspective, workers like Cindy should file these types of resolutions because, one, they're shareholders, two, they have the expertise, and they really know what is working and what isn't because they live it every day. And lastly, and I think most importantly, is that they're the people best positioned to make the case and build investor and popular support for why America needs workers on corporate boards. We see winning worker board representation on corporate boards as part of a broader strategy to stem corporate power over our lives and our democracy. To do so, we need companies to be accountable to all stakeholders, including the workers that make them profitable as well as our communities and shareholders. And we think that this is critical for the moment that we're in right now, where we really need, as a country, to address income inequality, climate change, and racial justice in order to build a more inclusive and sustainable democracy and economy. And so we believe that for corporations to actually be accountable, they need to have workers in the boardroom where it happens, where the decisions are being made. Lastly, I think that one of the reasons that we've had a lot of interest in it is that the space is really opening up because of the extreme income inequality in the U.S. You see many of our elected leaders put forward proposals like and legislation like Senator Baldwin, Senator Warren, Senator Sanders, all of whom are advocating for having workers on corporate boards as a way to address income inequality. And this is really helping to create an opening for us all to have this discussion and envision the change.
Great, thanks, Eddie. Thanks for putting Walmart into the larger context of inequality in the U.S. and also giving us some insight into why this company in particular was such an important target of this resolution. So, Cindy, we'll return to the resolution itself in the next round, but just to bring listeners up to speed on the issues that you and your fellow associates face, if workers gained representation to the board at Walmart, what key items would they put forward as priorities and why?
Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy Murray, and thank you all for having me. I've been at Walmart for 20 years this October, and believe it or not, I still don't even earn $15 an hour. At the same time, our CEO makes $23 million a year. That's 1,118 times more than an average associate. Something needs to change. Too many of us are not making it at Walmart. And now they started calling us essential workers, but we've always been essential. We're here to make sure our customers in our communities get food, get medication, and get help they need when they come into our stores. We know that policies and practices work to serve customers and retain and keep associates safe. If I were on the board of directors, I would invest in associates that make Walmart so profitable. We need to address the low wages and the lack of hours. We need affordable health care. If we can't put food on our plates, have time off to care for our kids when they get sick, or count on Walmart's health coverage when we get ill, then associates don't stick around. and high turnover is a big problem at Walmart. It impacts customer service. I have customers who have been coming to our store for years, and they know me. That personal relationship keeps customers coming back. If that customer is looking for a specific product or have questions about it, they want the associate to be knowledgeable. So having dedicated long-term employees is just good customer service. But there's fewer and fewer of us around. And if you don't have enough staff, like we don't now during COVID, the company is losing money. You can have all the products in the world, but they won't get sold if they're in the back room or not on our shelves. And Walmart's low wage, low road representation also keeps the company from growing. Do you know that there are no Walmarts in New York City, San Francisco, Boston, and only a few in DC and LA and Chicago? The reason is community opposition, because people don't want to shop at stores, that people are being treated so poorly. The bottom line is, if you keep your workers happy, your customers are happy and our investors are happy. As Walmart's founder, Sam Walton, said, the folks on the front lines, the ones who actually talk to the customer, are the only ones who really know what's going on out there. You better find out what they know.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Cindy, and thanks for giving us a vivid view of Associates' situation and why that should matter to the company as well. To close out this round, I'd like to turn to Janet, and I'd like to ask if you could please bring in the perspective from the UK. What are the key challenges to worker representation on boards there, and what is the current status of the debate on it in your country?
Yes, so hello everybody, very nice to be here. Thanks Liz, and thanks to all the other panelists. It's been very interesting so far. So the issue has risen up the agenda significantly in the UK in the last 5-7 years, both in terms of public awareness and in terms of, you know, what you could call policy debate. But in practice, we still have very few worker directors on UK company boards. So I'll sort of unpack this a little bit. I think the issue rising up the agenda in the UK was in part a response to campaigning by the trade union movement. We produced 3 reports between around 2013 and 16, making the case for worker directors and also setting out our proposals for how worker directors could be put in place in the UK context. But the appetite for change also, I think, reflects a significant deterioration of working conditions since the financial crisis in the UK. So even before COVID-19, average pay was still lower in real terms than before the financial crisis recession, and there'd been a significant rise in insecure work. And these issues were sort of brought to a head by various corporate scandals in which appalling workforce practices were revealed. And then I think the vote for Brexit really kind of focused the public policy minds on, you know, people's feelings of kind of powerlessness and lack of voice. And clearly the workforce is a very important, you know, part of people's lives. And I think the extent to which worker directors had kind of entered mainstream public policy debate is reflected in the fact that proposals to make worker directors mandatory for some companies were in the manifestos of the Labour, Lib Dem and Green Party in the last 2 general elections. So back to reality, our Conservative government has not made it mandatory, but we have had some quite important changes to the UK Corporate Governance Code. It's not what we'd like, but nonetheless significant. So before, our Corporate Governance Code focused entirely on the relationship between shareholders and the board, very much reflecting the model of shareholder primacy that Lenore was outlining earlier on. No other stakeholders were mentioned at all. So this has now changed, and the very first principle of the new code says that the board's role is to promote the long-term sustainable success of the company, generating value for shareholders and contributing to wider society. And it also says that the board should ensure effective engagement with stakeholders and specifies that for engagement with the workforce, one of the following methods should be used. A director appointed from the workforce, so a worker director as we would call it, a formal workforce advisory panel, or a designated non-executive director. So At the TC, our belief is that worker directors should be mandatory, required by law for companies over a certain size, and that worker directors should comprise 1/3 of the board with a minimum of 2 worker directors to avoid a lone voice scenario where it can be hard to make an impact. And we also argue that worker directors should be elected by the workforce. So these provisions are much weaker than we would like, but they're still better than nothing, depending on how they're implemented. So looking at the impact of the new code, company reports this year set out how companies have responded to the new requirements. Not all companies have reported yet, but basically we can see already that the vast majority of companies have simply designated an existing non-executive director to represent, in inverted commas, the workforce at the board. I mean, we're very critical of this approach and believe it is highly patronising. If there's going to be workforce engagement in governance, then workers are more than capable of participating themselves and don't need others to do it for them. And in some cases, the choice of non-executive director has been particularly problematic. So, for example, a serving CEO of another company in one case. Some companies have set up workforce advisory committees of some kind. We do have a concern that these could bypass trade unions where they're present in a company. So this is something that we do need to monitor. And just a very few companies so far have chosen the worker director route. Of these, only one has put 2 directors on the board, and none of the new ones responding to these requirements have allowed workers to elect the worker directors, although there is another company that's had, first group that's had worker directors since its inception, and they actually do, the worker director is elected by colleagues. So despite the regulatory nudge that we've had, there's a very low take-up by companies, which is disappointing, but because the provision is basically voluntary, it's also not surprising. So I think the key challenge that we have then is the attitude of many board members, existing board members in the UK, and what I'd call sort of corporate governance insiders, if you like, on the issue, which I think is based largely on a confusion about the role of worker directors and a lack of understanding about the benefits that worker directors would bring to the table. So in one point that is repeatedly raised with me is concern that worker directors will bring industrial relations into the boardroom, but that's not the role of worker directors. Industrial relations is the role of trade unions and should be resolved through collective bargaining. But having worker directors in the boardroom, brings a workforce perspective and their experience to decisions, at the beginning of the decision-making process, and also bringing that perspective into the full range of decisions that affect the company and affect all of its stakeholders. And Eddie and Cindy were kind of outlining the importance of that in the Walmart case. And confidentiality is often cited as another fear, and it's one that is just not backed up by the experience of countries that actually have worker directors. This kind of myth of there being lots and lots of leaks is just not the case. And I think many boards just frankly don't think that their workforce are up to it. So my hope is that even though it's a small start and a slow start, the companies that have opted for the worker director route will break down misconceptions about how it works, and that the worker directors themselves, the ones who I've met have been great, that they'll act for kind of ambassadors on the issue going forwards.
Great, thanks very much, Janet, for giving us an additional perspective and some hope about incremental changes going on in your country. So let's go into our second round of questions here, and let's talk a bit more about the substance of the Walmart resolution and also dig deeper on some general obstacles to worker representation on boards, as well as hopefully opportunities for addressing these. So you should see on your screen a slide with the just the resolved paragraph of the Walmart resolution that was filed by Cindy in June of this year at Walmart, just to give you an idea of what was being asked for. So turning to you, Cindy, first, you were directly involved in filing the resolution at Walmart. Could you please tell us, how did you make your case in favor of the resolution to the company's investors?
I was inspired to file by one of my former coworkers, Janie Grice, who filed a similar resolution last year. She invited Bernie Sanders to speak on her behalf, and he came down to Arkansas to argue for why we need workers on Walmart's board. but this is something that we've been working on for a while. We spent the last 2 years talking about how corporate boards work. I attended a training with MIT professors and former corporate board members where we learned how boards operate and how board members can influence corporate decision making. The shareholder proposal that I filed simply asked Walmart to include hourly associates as candidates for the company's board of directors. It is similar to the Rooney Rule in the NFL that requires teams to interview minority candidates for head coaching and senior football operation job openings. As a result, the NFL has a lot more Black coaches. Before Walmart's annual shareholders meeting this year, I was part of a group of 5 hourly Walmart associates who participated in a series of trainings on what it means to be on a corporate board and how to make our case to investors. Together with our friends at Majority Action, we met with investors with nearly $3 trillion in assets to advocate for the proposal. It was amazing. I represented to investors with ICCR and others and found people very receptive to our argument that people like me would add value to Walmart's board of directors. Back to you, Liz.
Great, thanks very much. Eddie, sticking with the proposal at Walmart, it received about 5% of non-Walton family shares voted at the meeting. Once you exclude shares not voted, broker non-votes, and abstentions. What do you take away from those results, and what are the next steps in this campaign? And if you have time to briefly comment, tag this on, your thoughts on the broader prospects for shareholder resolutions on worker representation on boards.
Sure. So yeah, as you point out, the Walton family owns half of the outstanding shares at Walmart. And so inevitably, you get a small vote. But we did have some support from US and European investors, including some public support from state treasurers and a few pension funds. ISS recommended that their public funds support the proposal. And I think from our conversations with investors that we saw that people understood that board representation would be a benefit for investors and a solution to some of the problems at Walmart. That said, I think that US investors are new to this issue and likely don't have internal guidelines as to how to vote for such proposals. And in our experience, when institutional investors don't usually act without policies. And this is not unusual. Decades ago, investors would similarly vote to oppose resolutions disclosing gender pay gaps, for example. But after years of work with the gender justice community, many investors now automatically vote yes for such proposals. So we see this as a starting point. Similarly, board declassification proposals, which now routinely get majority votes, started out by getting much lower votes. That said, we did make some headway, and I think that Cindy's proposal started some very important conversations with investors. We think we need these to continue, and so filing at other companies are critical. They'll help investors engage on the issue, see the merits, and we hope develop a position in favor of the proposal. And unfortunately, the issues that we raised around the company's ineffective COVID response aren't going away. And so as we look for other opportunities for investors and corporate leaders to come to value the experience and wisdom of frontline employees, we've also been calling on Walmart's board to sit down with frontline hourly workers as part of a COVID task force in order to address how to operate safely during the pandemic. And we see the creation of a task force on COVID, not just at Walmart, but at other places too, is a way for essential workers to work with the board, build trust on something that's of mutual concern and critical to all of us in this moment. And we think this is one good way to demonstrate how the voice of frontline employees as part of corporate decision-making is one of the best things we can do to protect employee and public health.
Great, thanks, Eddie, and thanks for bringing in comparison to other issues that over the years, that when they were first filed looked like it was an impossibility, and those barriers have been broken down over the years. And I think we can say that broadly about human rights-based resolutions that used to get barely enough to be refiled, and now are routinely getting quite large percentages at EGMs. And we'll come back to the issue of COVID and Walmart in the final round. Janet, just digging a bit more on the investor angle here. So although worker representation on boards garners high public support in the US and the UK, and at least as Eddie mentioned, some pension funds and other funds have supported resolutions in its favor, many investors do not. So commenting on the low level of investor support, what is their reasoning, and why, in your view, should investors support worker representation on boards?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think, again, many investors don't understand the role of worker directors and just underestimate the benefits that they bring. It's important to know, I think, that not all investors take this position. There are some significant UK investors, like Aviva, for example, that have been very supportive of worker directors and supported, I think, just about all of the various shareholder resolutions on the topic, certainly the Walmart one, and also Royal London as well, and a few others, Rebecca, which I think is Dutch. So, I mean, why should investors support? Well, I mean, I think in a nutshell, because the inclusion of worker directors will lead to better quality decision-making by the board. Any decision the board makes has to be implemented by the workforce. And there's very clear evidence from countries where worker directors are the norm that bringing a workforce perspective on how decisions will work, in practice on the ground is one of the things that other directors around the table value most about having worker directors at the board. Another point is diversity. There's much greater understanding now of the importance of board diversity and the contribution that makes to board decision making. But social diversity is often left out of this discussion. So again, worker directors make a very important contribution to board diversity. And again, where they are in place, guarding against groupthink is acknowledged to be one of the benefits of having them on the board. I mean, Cindy and Eddie were talking about Walmart's kind of workforce practices. And, worker directors are clearly very well qualified to boost the board's understanding of the importance of workforce relationship, the importance of, investing in the workforce. And there's an absolutely proven link between workforce engagement and company success. So, overall, greater workforce voice in decision-making would encourage companies to focus on long-term company success rather than short-term financial engineering. I think investor caution is surprising given that worker directors are the norm in many of Europe's most successful economies. Across Europe, around 19 countries have some provisions for worker directors, and in 13 of those countries, they're extensive in that they apply to a wide range, to most basically of the private sector. So, this is a tried and tested measure that works well. And comparing those different European countries, those that have got strong provision for workforce voice do better on a whole range of measures, from kind of higher R&D expenditure, high employment rates, lower rates of poverty, and lower rates of inequality. So basically, it's a different model of corporate governance, and one that promotes a different business model for companies based on what we would sort of call the high road rather than the low road. But I think often, fear of change, fear of the unknown, in my view, prejudice can mitigate against change, but we need to look at the positive examples where it exists and learn from that.
Great, thanks, Janet, for some really solid arguments about the added value of workers on the board. Lenore, focusing specifically on the U.S., and so a couple of you have mentioned Senator Baldwin. Tammy Baldwin is one of the sponsors of the Reward Work Act, which I mentioned at the outset of the conversation. According to research on her site, quote, nations with more worker empowerment have higher wages and higher real wage growth than the United States, and firms with worker empowerment produce 9% higher returns for shareholders and undertake twice the amount of investment as firms that do not have workers on boards, unquote, which really backs up what Janet was just talking about. Multiple countries with good experience having workers on boards. Given that kind of evidence, why is there so much resistance in the United States to worker representation on boards? And what are some of the changes needed in this country to ease the way for such representation?
Yeah, great questions. I think that it'll take more than 1 minute or two to answer them. And I know, by the way, a lot of the folks that I'm seeing as attendees to this have a lot of expertise on this issue as well. So hopefully we can continue the conversation after this hour. But I think that I'll just name a couple maybe obvious reasons. The first is the tremendous economic and political power of the wealthy and interest in protecting status quo. Obviously, many of you have just spoken about the complicated role of the investor community on these types of issues. I think there's two other reasons that I think are totally surmountable. So I want to be an optimist maybe in this time of deep difficulty in our nation. One is that it's not clear to everyone that shareholder primacy is an ideology or an idea that can be changed, right? We have to sort of reclaim this idea that corporations are institutions that are granted permission to operate by the public, and in a democracy, which we still are, we have the ability to actually shape the rules that govern how corporations operate, including corporate governance. The idea that corporations are really just little markets that should operate according to a sort of neoliberal model where everyone just bargains and the state should stay out of it, that needs to go. We need to end that way of thinking about what corporations are and then change the laws that govern corporate relationships to ensure that different groups of stakeholders participate in the governance process. And then I think for many of us, I think so many of us on this call come out of the labor movement in one way or other. I think that there's a real need right now to really think about the mutual reinforcing strength that there could be between increasing collective bargaining and union organizing and worker representation on boards. These things should not be seen as at odds. And I think the example of the work that's happening by Janet really, and her organization in the UK is so important on that front. And we need to think about the relationship between corporate and labor law. I have a paper about this up on SSRN, so anyone who wants to policy nerd out with me on these concepts, I'd love feedback on that. And then the final thing I'll say briefly is we all know, we're living through a time of horrifying climate change. It's now, it's happening, the wildfires, the floods, the feeling of powerlessness over climate change that we're all feeling right now. Obviously, worker representation on boards would not be a silver bullet solution to the problem of climate change, but we need to understand the role that corporations' ability to freely pollute and to continue to push off their externalities onto the public, we need to understand how that's a problem that contributes to climate change and see changing decision-making within the corporate boardroom as one of the many things we need to do to address climate change. And so I think bringing that into our strategies is another important piece for really making this issue live within the American public conversation.
Great, thanks, Lenore. You've packed an incredible number of points into a couple of minutes. I really appreciate that, and also, again, ending on a positive note that that these things are surmountable. We just need to kind of open up our imagination here and see where the links are. For the final round, I'd just like to introduce a couple of questions touching on COVID-19, which has come up on the edges here, and also to talk about racial inequality, and then finally just briefly explore some further criticisms of worker representation on boards. So again, starting with you, Cindy. In May of this year, as part of your argument for worker representation on the board, you and other Walmart associates made a filing to the Securities and Exchange Commission outlining Walmart's failure to keep workers safe during the pandemic, which is something that Eddie mentioned. Could you please give us some brief highlights of that argument and why having workers on the board could help specifically on that?
When the coronavirus hit, the disconnect between Walmart's official COVID-19 policies and what was actually happening on the ground in our stores became a matter of life and death for associates and the communities we serve. Everyone at Walmart especially those of us who are getting up there in age and are at higher risk, are scared to go to work for good reasons. Thousands of my coworkers have got the coronavirus at work, including over 80 associates in one store in Massachusetts. At least 20 Walmart associates have died. At least that's what we know, but the real number is likely much higher. In our exempt solicitation, we explained how Walmart executives have proven themselves too far removed from day-to-day store operations to implement consistent and effective policies that truly protect associates and customers. For example, we surveyed over 1,500 Walmart employees and demonstrated how Walmart's paid leave policy still results in associates coming to work even when they're sick. None of us should want employees who might have coronavirus symptoms to feel like they need to come to work anyway because they're afraid of being penalized or of losing pay. That puts all of us at risk, employees and customers alike. We talked about the lack of consistent cleaning. Our stores are still dirty. The air filters at my store, for example, look filthy. Our bathrooms aren't being sanitized enough. These are all things we can fix, but the company needs to know what isn't working. Meanwhile, Walmart is making huge profits during this pandemic. They can afford to do better by giving people enough paid time off, enforcing social distancing, and keeping our stores clean. And Walmart should share their massive profits with essential workers like me. We don't even get hazard pay. I didn't sign up to work at a place that is not concerned about whether I will bring home a disease that can kill me and my family. Walmart policies themselves and the way those policies are inconsistently implemented is putting our health and the health of our families and customers at risk. That's why we need a voice at the top. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy, for a really vivid account of this disconnect, and I think a clear demonstration of what Lenore and others have been talking about, of the worker expertise and the ability for workers to bring these things to the attention of the company. Lenore, staying on the theme of COVID for a moment, companies in many sectors, just to mention a few, mining, retail, garments, have been accused of using COVID-19 as an excuse to curtail freedom of association and to fire workers who try to organize to gain a voice in the workplace. In your view, what are the implications of the pandemic for worker representation on boards as a concept and a reality? That is, in the larger context of COVID-19 and calls for a national and global rethink on workers' rights, is this a moment of more opportunity for worker representation on boards or of greater challenges to it, do you think?
Oh, both, I'd say. We live in a time of, what is the phrase? Beware of living in interesting times, right? So I think, building on what Cindy just said, we understand better, as a whole nation, really, what it means to be a frontline worker, what it means to be an essential worker, and why workers in retail, in fast food, as well as in education and our emergency services are really the most important workers we have in the nation, and why they have expertise for those working in private corporations that the corporate boards need to hear. And I won't repeat all of, I think, what Cindy just so laid out so well. I think we're also getting a better sense that worker actions work and that social movements have power. And so we need to, building on what Janet said before, this idea of worker representation on boards is just one way to address imbalances of power and a sense of powerlessness that really so many of us have experienced. We live in a time of great upheaval when many of the fissures in our economy are being laid more bare than ever, when our government can figure out how to appoint perhaps or nominate new Supreme Court justices, but can't figure out how to support the millions of people out of work. So I think that there's going to be growing interest in how to address these imbalances over time. I also think that on this particular issue of how corporations work, as some folks will know, last year, there was a really, the Business Roundtable, which is America's largest sort of trade association for large corporations, came out and said, we have decided that now we believe that corporations need to act in the interest of all stakeholders. And there was a lot of debate sort of pre-COVID about what that actually meant, what it was going to look like. But then COVID hit, and we saw that actually most large corporations weren't really bringing their workers back in to bring up their voices about what needed to happen to keep workers safe, to keep customers safe, and to keep companies working in such a time of difficulty. So I think that now that there's this opening about moving beyond shareholder primacy, we need to really capitalize on it and move forward and say, no, it's not really, companies can't actually operate in the interest of all stakeholders if stakeholders, especially workers, are not at the decision-making table.
Great, thanks very much, Lenore. I want to focus specifically on the question of racial justice, and I turn to you, Eddie. The protests against racial inequality have shown a spotlight on the inequities that Black people and people of color in general face in all walks of life, not least the workplace. How might worker representation on boards be implemented in such a way as to specifically address racial discrimination and injustice within companies?
Thanks, Liz. I think there's a fundamental dishonesty in the way that most corporations approach racial justice, especially as we're seeing in this moment. Of course, it is great to see major CEOs voice support for Black lives, and I think that reflects the impact that the movement for Black lives is having, which is truly shifting our culture and winning real change. But the CEO statements in support of Black lives ignore the daily impact that these same corporations have on their own workforces and communities. At Amazon, for example, Bezos made a statement, and at the same time, he's firing and retaliating against Black employees who are fighting for better working conditions. And his corporate leadership even planned a racist smear against a Black coronavirus whistleblower, calling him not smart or articulate. And Amazon is selling facial recognition software to the same police departments that are killing Black people with impunity. So corporations can't have it both ways. At Walmart, Black workers are disproportionately concentrated in lower paying non-managerial positions. And the company time and again refuses to disclose if Black workers are paid less than white workers, or if Black workers are concentrated in typically lower paying part-time positions. These are questions that boards should be asking, but they're not. And as one of our leaders from North Carolina, Carolyn Davis, said in an NBC op-ed, Black employees need to be on the board in order to have a real voice in the day-to-day business decisions that affect our livelihoods and our communities. And I think if we don't, we're leaving it to the existing boards, which we know are mostly white, mostly male, and typically millionaires or billionaires. And we're leaving it to them to make decisions that impact all of us. Recent polling by Data for Progress showed strong majority support for having workers on boards, even in red states. And the strongest supporters are among the Black, Latinx, and Asian communities. And I think, getting back to Lenore's point of, this is one piece of the puzzle to really stem corporate power. And I think when we look at like the Fight for 15 movement, for example, that really changed the discussion on how workers should be paid, that resulted in concrete changes to public policy. And so we see this as one avenue that if popularized and gains momentum, can help shift the way that corporations in the US act on all the issues that we care about.
Great, thanks, Eddie. And we're coming close to the top of the hour, and I did want to get one or two questions from the audience in. So Janet, just finally turning to a very specific criticism leveled at worker representation on boards. So critics of the concept have argued that it could lead to a worker veto, or that worker representatives on boards are not independent. If you can do it in 1 minute, how do you respond to these concerns?
Try to be very quick. Well, basically, worker directors share the same directors' duties as other company directors, and they're there to focus on the long-term success of the company. But their role is to bring a workforce perspective to all the many decisions that are relevant to this overall aim. And, you know, as Cindy was saying with Walmart, it's also to bring a bit of reality to the boardroom, bit of reality into the decision-making process, but it's not a direct representational role. That is for trade unions and for collective bargaining. I mean, I won't go into them because of time, but there are parallels for that kind of role. You know, on pension funds, you have employer-nominated pension fund trustees working alongside member-nominated pension trustees, and all of them have the same fiduciary duties requiring them to act in the best interests of the pension of the pensioners and the members, but they're coming from different positions, and that's reflected in the structure. So that's a good parallel, I think. As for a worker veto, worker directors don't have a veto anywhere in the world. Even in countries where half the board members are worker directors, the chair has the deciding vote. And I think it's important to emphasise that boards with worker directors are generally consensual, you know, as are many boards. It's just that a wider range of voices and experiences have fed into that decision making. So, yeah, at the end of the day, it's a voice, not a veto.
Great, thanks very much. So, sorry to rush this a bit, but I do want to make a quick turn for 1 minute to the questions from the audience. We obviously are not going to get to all of them. There are quite a few, but just taking one of them for example. So one question is, what has been the response of major responsible investors to these proposals? My sense has been that there has been little take-up. If so, why? And how about the response by proxy advisory services and public pensions? I don't know if if one of you wants to jump in on that.
I mean, very quick comment is that there is some variation among investors. I think I mentioned earlier that in the UK, Aviva and Royal London, for example, have both voted nearly all of the shareholder resolutions on worker directors. So it's not absolutely uniform. And also just looking at the voting, I think somebody said earlier that ISS had recommended in favour of support of Cindy's resolution at Walmart, and that you can see that in the voting. There were a few investors who opposed all the other resolutions on worker directors, but they did support that one, but probably because ISS recommended in support. So we need to work on the investors and also on the proxy advisors as well, because if we could bring around organisations like ISS, it would have an impact on investors who just follow their recommendations.
Just to clarify on ISS, sorry, it was for their public funds, so it wasn't the ISS giving an endorsement of that. ISS actually recommended against it. Okay.
Great. Well, we're 1 minute from the top of the hour, so unfortunately, I don't think that we can open up for more questions. But what we can do is we can share these with the speakers and try to get answers back to people. So I just wanted to give a couple of closing remarks before we move into a couple of closing slides. I can't possibly summarize such a rich discussion, obviously, but a couple of takeaways. It's obviously not about a blueprint or a model for all countries, as other observers and speakers today have pointed out. We need a broad set of institutions for worker representation on boards to work. And it is not a silver bullet, as Lenore said. It's only one of many needed changes. But that said, the pandemic and the protests for racial justice and the rise in worker activism and a growing focus on the profound inequalities in society are clearly forcing a rethink on corporate structures and corporate governance and companies' impact on their stakeholders. And for these reasons, I think it's the right time to have a meaningful discussion about worker representation on boards and how it can contribute to addressing the significant challenges that we're all facing in these uncertain times. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining. I'd like to say thank you to those who donated their ticket registration. A very big thank you to our speakers, Lenore, Cindy, Eddie, and Janet. And thank you to the team at Croatan. for their help on this webinar. If you enjoyed this conversation, there are many ways to provide support going forward, and you can see on the screen, you can sponsor a future conversation, you can donate at the link on the slide, croataninstitute.org/donate. You can provide feedback using the survey form that'll pop up at the end of the conversation, or by emailing conversations@croataninstitute.org. And then in the chat box, you'll see social media links to keep the conversation going. And just one last reminder, our last slide, that our next conversation is on October 28th on multi-region perspectives on conservation finance and sustainable forestry. You can learn more and register at croatanconversations.org. Thanks very much for attending, everyone, and we hope to see you at another conversation soon. Please stay well. Bye.